We're joined by energy analyst Clyde Mallinson. Clyde, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. What determines the tariff hike for Eskom, which Nersa has to evaluate, are almost always only exclusively the input costs, not necessarily the downturn of the revenue collected by Eskom. The sense I'm getting is that Eskom is dealing with a situation of runaway input costs. But that doesn't seem to be the case coming from the commodities that Eskom relies on. Coal prices have been largely stable. In fact, coal prices in the domestic market haven't shifted by the margin in the electricity increase that we're seeing for next year at least. What are the cost drivers for Eskom that it can't seem to contain that's leading it to ask for higher than inflation tariff increases?
Okay, hi, thanks for having me on the show. Just to get a few things straight. Both Nersa and Eskom work with the same formula to calculate the so-called amount that Eskom can ask for in revenue. And yes, it does include input costs, but it also includes return on Eskom's investment, depreciation on their assets, and a number of other things. But the fact that they both use the same methodology, I think I was interviewed a month or two ago on radio or TV, I can't remember, where I said that Eskom calculating that they needed, remember, a 36% increase, followed by, I think it was 12 and 9 or something. And Nersa, using the same methodology, said, no, it's actually, 12.7 and 6 and 5. And I questioned at the time and said, they can't both be using the same equation, if you like, with more or less the same inputs and coming up with such different answers. And in fact, that's what's happened now. So the Nersa mistake...
So perhaps just to pause you there, Clyde, why is it then that they come out with different outputs when they have similar inputs? Is it because perhaps they have a different assessment of the assumptions underlying some of those input variables?
Why is it that maths pupils in exams have the same question and come out with different answers? I honestly can't tell you. It shouldn't be that complicated. So they should spend more time on checking that they both are using the same inputs, because the equation is set out. If they both were to use the same inputs exactly, they should get exactly the same answer. So to my mind, the Nersa error is not costing us additional amount. If they hadn't made the error, they would have granted Eskom a higher increase in the first place. All it's actually doing is getting us to lose confidence in the ability of Nersa to regulate. That's what's happened. If they hadn't have made the mistake, which they're calling it, remember it was about 107 billion, the difference. And then Nersa basically said, geez, we can't go to the public and look for 107 billion. And that's where the so-called closed doors discussion between Nersa and Eskom took place. And they kind of settled out of court, as it were, and said, well, let's split the difference and make it 54 billion.
Why do you think Nersa felt pressure to engage in an out-of-court settlement conversation? 5-6 years ago, when Eskom took Nersa to court, again, on the exact same question, Nersa won. And Nersa had to enact the tariff increases that they had assessed. Eskom didn't win on that. Surely if Nersa applied the same arguments...
My experience is that Eskom have actually won more frequently than Nersa when it's gone to court. So the argument was, I don't know, I think Nersa was probably looking for the settlement because, quite frankly, I would be embarrassed if I'd made 107 billion rand mistake with the same equation as what Eskom had, and then went and said, look, rather than take this through the courts and stall the whole thing, let's settle out of court and let's split the difference. And they kind of always split the difference if you look at it. Eskom asked for 30%, Nersa gives them 15. Eskom asked for 20%, Nersa gives them 10. So there always seems to me to be a splitting of the difference. And in this last instance, with the increase, the difference wasn't split. Because Eskom was asking for 36, and if we say CPI was about 5, that's about 40. So I was expecting Nersa to give them a 20% increase, and they didn't. And then I thought, gee, well, what's going on? And this is what's going on.
Yeah.
They got their numbers wrong.
When you look at large industrial outfits who are Eskom customers, South 32, ArcelorMittal, approaching Nersa asking for exemptions, that seems to be a shift in the market that we haven't seen before, where large-scale energy consumers are saying we can't afford this, and neither do we have the capital to go off-grid or explore alternatives. Well, does Nersa have the legislative and statutory powers to entertain an exemption application?
Well, there's been what are called negotiated pricing agreements for for quite some time now, particularly with South 32 and with, I think, some of the chrome smelters. The argument that they're going to go out of business because they can't tolerate the electricity price could well be used for all the small SMMEs that go out of business because they can't survive the electricity price. So by and large, I think it's not a great idea. The argument has been that the big users use a consistent amount through the day and through the night, so they aren't what we call increasing the demand at peak times. And it's often that peak demand that comes about mainly by residential and small commercial and industrial users that causes Eskom to have to run its open cycle diesel turbines. And those diesel turbines cost a lot of money. They cost Eskom more to generate power at those peak times than what they actually sell the power for. And so they kind of say, well, at least those big guys don't fluctuate in their usage. And we don't ever really have to run diesel turbines to meet their demand. We have to do that to meet the vagaries, if you like, of the load profile of people who switch on, who start cooking at 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, etc. So that's kind of been the argument. But to my mind, there's only really one solution. When you're selling a product, if you want to make the price cheaper, you have to sell more of the product. And so the way we drive down the electricity price is to double or triple our output of electricity. And if we do that, we will be able to dramatically reduce the price of electricity at the same time as.
But don't you have an equilibrium crisis there where you've increased your output supply, but you haven't been able to increase demand because there are constraints on the demand side, which is affordability?
No, okay. So remember, these two things work hand in hand. I'm talking about reducing cost by increasing supply. And we also talking, the minister often talks about the 10 million or 11 million households that are close to energy poverty. Well, the minister's a little bit out of kilter there because there's been 10 or 11 million South African households who have been living in energy poverty, probably for the last 5 years at least. And so they need to dramatically increase their consumption. And in so doing, it would lift them out of energy poverty. And if we increased our electricity supply, the cost of electricity would be much lower. So the ideal is to increase the electricity to those 10 million households who live in energy poverty at the same cost as what they're currently paying to live in energy poverty, if you see what I'm getting at. So we're talking about quadrupling their uptake at the same cost, which means essentially a 75% reduction in the cost of electricity to those households. We need to be having a fixed cost for electricity for those 10 million households.
The minister is also under the impression that there's room to reconfigure the tariff structure, which will drive down costs. Can you reconfigure the tariff structure without changing the input variables?
No, I think the costs are on a nasty upward trajectory. You can't be increasing supply from renewable and other resources and not systematically shutting down your old resources. This is a bit like buying a new car but keeping the old one in the garage in case the new one doesn't work. And you've still got to pay the license fees on the old one, and you've still got to do this and that. You can't keep the same assets operational when you're starting to bring in new generation. So the model I have that I really think is the solution is to actually put those 10 million households on the sell side of electricity, not the buy side.
Yeah.
These mechanisms whereby they can have a preference share participation in the sale of electricity to their own municipalities, and thereby they earning dividends because the electricity price is high, rather than trying to manage to buy electricity at that high price. You flip it so that the 10 million households become sellers of electricity rather than buyers.
Yeah.
And they obviously can supply themselves at the same time then.
Yeah. Clyde Mallinson, thank you so much for your time this evening. I really do appreciate your insights on this. Clyde Mallinson is an energy analyst.